Thank you for tuning into this on-demand Madison Network webinar. This presentation features 2006 alumnus Zach Mercurio and the exciting glimpse into his first authored book, The Invisible Leader. Transform your life, work, and organization with the power of authentic purpose. Zach is one of the leading experts on the role of purpose and meaning in organizations and life. Through speaking, consulting, and research, Zach has helped diverse organizations and individuals from around the world understand how purpose and meaning unleashes human potential to create thriving organizations and lives. He is the founder and author of PurposeSpeaks.com, the popular blog on purposeful leadership, work, and life. He is also a regular contributor on purpose for the Huffington Post and other international media outlets, as well as the newest author of the acclaimed book, The Invisible Leader, Transform Your Life, Work, and Organization with the Power of Authentic Purpose. Zach also serves as a researcher and adjunct faculty at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he teaches courses on purposeful leadership and organizational development as he completes his PhD in organizational learning, performance, and change. His research has been featured in the Human Resource Development Review and at the Academy of Human Resource Development International Research Conference. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to Zach for today's presentation.
It's great to have you all tuning in on this webinar. Again, my name is Zach, and today what I want to talk to you about is how we compel both ourselves and everyone in any organization or movement that we're a part of. And for the last century or so, we've tended to think that people are generally motivated by results, by the things they get for what they do, or by money or another person, these extrinsic or outward leaders that influence our behaviors. And the way we've been thinking about motivation, in my opinion, and through my research I found, has been a big mistake. And that mistake has been really apparent to me as I worked and researched The Invisible Leader, the new book. And basically, what I found was that the most powerful motivators of our lives, our behaviors, our attitudes, our actions, and the actions and attitudes of anybody that are in an organization with you are actually not people or results or things at all. It's almost invisible. And that invisible leader is a common, compelling, other-centered purpose. And so today I'm going to talk about this new idea of invisible leadership, this new kind of radical redefinition of what leaders and leadership is and are, and so we can reframe and use these tools to transform organizations, our lives, and the people that we work with. But I think the best way to describe what the invisible leader is through a story. And here in Colorado, where I'm based, the University of Colorado Buffaloes football team won the national championship in 1990. But just 2 years prior to that, in 1988, they were still a team that was struggling, sort of middle of the road in their conference. And traditional leadership theories don't explain what happened between 1988, a mediocre team, and the national championship team in 1990. You see, the coaches were the same, the players were the same, the level of talent was the same, the way they practiced was the same, the competition was essentially the same, but their performance was radically different over 2 years. And when you look back at that team early in the 1989 season, when they were getting prepared for that season, one of their star young quarterbacks, the future of the franchise, the future of the team, started showing up to practice, and he was vomiting, and it was at sometimes vomiting blood. And that 1989 Buffaloes football team, they sort of rallied around him and brought him to the hospital that day. And a couple of days later, they found out that Sal Ayunis, who was the quarterback at the time, was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer. And that stomach cancer had spread throughout his body. And the doctors gave him just months to live. But Sal, the quarterback, vowed that he would play football again. He vowed to fight. He would show up to practices for the team and give emotional talks about the importance of fight and the importance of resilience. And this incredibly inspired this team. In fact, sometimes during the early parts of the 1989 season, Sal would show up at Folsom Field in Boulder and sit in a particular area of the stands. And the whole team would come to the center, as you see in this picture here, and point up to where Sal was sitting. All of a sudden, the coaches didn't really have to do anything. This purpose, this bigger reason for existence was starting to form. They were literally playing for Sal. And unfortunately and sadly, a few weeks into the 1989 season, Sal did pass away from his cancer. But the idea of Sal, the idea of playing for Sal, lived on. And if you notice in this picture, everybody was pointing at something bigger, something higher than all of them. And when you talk to coaches during that time, in fact, in interviews where the local newspaper did with the quarterback's coach or the head coach, they said things like, the bus drove itself, or they just knew what to do, or we didn't really have to do anything to motivate them that year. And they attributed to this idea of playing for Sal. This big other-centered purpose fused the team together, helped people to perform better in each of their different roles on that team. And that is the invisible leader, that when our teams, when our lives, when our organizations transcend collectively to something higher, it fuses us together as people. And that is its power, because all of a sudden, it didn't matter the different personalities on the team, or the different functions on the team, or the different skill levels on the team. Because a higher purpose, the invisible leader, the authentic purpose, is so powerful that it levels the playing field, because no one person is greater than the purpose. And that is the invisible leader. And that's the power of the invisible leader, when we have a big, other-centered, human-centered, common purpose that binds people together in our teams and organizations. So I want to do a couple of things here today. I want to talk about what is invisible leadership, why invisible leadership is necessary to answer to some of the most pressing concerns among organizations and society today, and then how do we lead from purpose? How do we awaken the invisible leader in our lives and our organizations? The idea of invisible leadership actually comes from Mary Parker Follett, who was a social worker and a management consultant back in the late 1920s. And she had really redefined leadership as being less about coercing and commanding people to being more about leading with freedom. What is the force that allows people to make decisions and choices based on where they're coming from to accomplish this bigger purpose? How do we make leadership more than just about a person? And Mary Parker Follett said, leaders and followers are both following the invisible leader, the common purpose. When we put common purpose and the authentic purpose, the reason for whatever it is that we're doing at the core of our lives and organizations, we lead with this idea of freedom, and we can fuse people together in devotion to that common purpose. And invisible leadership is really a radical redefinition of leadership. We've traditionally tried to define leadership as being attached to a person, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, a specific type of person, a person with particular characteristics, a person who's in a power position. But invisible leadership removes any one person or a group of people from the equation. It asserts that people aren't commanded by a person, but they're inspired by a purpose. So purpose doesn't command us like a person does. it inspires us to something bigger. And that inspirational force is incredibly powerful in organizations. And then the key shift of invisible leadership is moving from this idea of power over to power with. When we lead with authentic purpose, we lead with togetherness because people are bound together through the pursuit of a common destiny. And exploring invisible leadership further, Hickman and Sorensen, which are two leadership scholars, they surveyed 21 high-performing companies and nonprofits. And what they found as a key element to their performance and their success was that each of them had a deeply held common destiny or a sense of calling that illuminated and aligned people's values that were already inherent within them and beliefs and became that key ingredient in the organization's both financial and social success. In fact, when these people were interviewed in these studies, they talked about that the shared purpose was both the primary reason people wanted to work at the organization, but also one of the primary reasons that they wanted to stay in the organization. And so they called the idea that purpose has this power the charisma of purpose. That again, it's not any one person that has the power, it's the purpose that has this charisma to do so. And as leaders, we can actually awaken this sense of purpose. They also liken purpose to the blue notes. If you listen to jazz music, there are the in-between notes that really bring the whole piece together. They are what the musician decides to do and play or not do in between the notes that actually signifies to others in the quartet or others in the band of what to do next. And so these symbols, these ways of communicating that are sort of in between, that is how they liken this force of purpose. It's invisible because you can't see it, but it bonds the group together. It's the in-between notes of an organization and of a team, and in our lives as well. Invisible leadership serves as a force that combines and coalesces all of the different random things that we do in our life so that it's attached to a common story and a common narrative. And with invisible leadership, when the invisible leader or the purpose is the most powerful leader in an organization and not a person, we end up with motivation as a result. And people who are in purposeful organizations who have an invisible leader that is clear and it's other-centered and it's believed, they aren't motivated and productive because they have to be. But what I found in writing The Invisible Leader is that they are motivated and productive because they deeply want to be. And this deep desire to be motivated and productive for the common purpose and not a person is what separates purposeful people in organizations and from organizations that use traditional motivation tactics to drive employees and push them forward. Purpose pulls people forward and elicits that desire and that motivation and that inspiration to strive towards fulfilling the purpose. So why invisible leadership now? Why a philosophy that basically says that people aren't the most powerful leaders, that purpose is? So what I want you to do is just for a second, if you could think of the first time where you learned what or who a leader was, and think of who was there, what was happening, who was around, how you knew that person was a leader, and just take about 30 seconds just to think about that. Now, when I ask this question in some of the courses that I teach, most common examples include, the peer who always won playing tag on the playground, the appointed hall monitors that many of you may remember wearing the orange vests in grade school, or parents and older siblings. Many people talk about teachers. And almost always, when you think about those first moments where we learned what a leader was, there was someone that was labeled, for example, as a parent, teacher, monitor, captain, and that they always had an appointed role in which they were freely given power that was most of the time unquestioned. There's usually little questioning as to why the leaders had power at the time, and often, sometimes it can seem arbitrary. And most of the scenarios that we remember, like I bet the one you're thinking of right now, involve commanding, controlling, or you having to be an expert at something or older to be a leader. And these earliest experiences with leadership in our society are incredibly formative. They're the first steps in a lifetime of viewing leadership as primarily about power and positions. When I ask this question of students in my classes, the traits they describe are the same ones that have dominated the major leadership theories which have guided our lives and organizations for more than a century, and which recent research finds is not particularly motivating or compelling for people, and they don't provide an inclusive path to leadership. And so if invisible leadership is an alternative, I want to talk briefly about what it is an alternative to. And so some of the most dominant theories of leadership are one, a great man or trait-based theory that leaders are either men who are in positions of power, or they have particular traits that make them good leaders, like they can speak well, they're tall, they're wealthy. Those particular trait-based theories of leadership back up way into the early 19th centuries, and that conceptualization of leadership that were really around from out of the military leadership styles, and we can see those still sometimes, including political and economic systems today. Now, situational theories argue that you can learn to be a certain type of leader if you learn how certain situations can work, that it's this repeatable phenomenon, that it has to be learned. Behavioral theories talk about specific behaviors that good leaders adopt and enact. Transactional theories are leaders that are able to provide good transactions in terms of rewards, benefits, and punishments that promote good performance amongst the team. And then finally, relationship theories that focus on the transformation and are concerned with the connections between leaders and followers. And the radical departure to all of that is this idea of invisible leadership, because the problem is nearly every one of those theories excludes people from being leaders and is based solely on traditional ideas of power over. And I want you to think about your current organization or life and look at these theories. Which type of theory do you operate from most in your organization? Is it, you think leaders are positional, or are leaders most often seen as the ones who can best navigate situation, or the ones who navigate and have responsibility? And how does that power over mentality, if it does exist, how does it influence people's motivation? Because when purpose becomes the most powerful leader, we lead with freedom, the opposite of commanding and controlling. And so this is powerful. This is a powerful idea that I have uncovered through my work and research, is that people experience leadership as being more accessible because anybody can seek to deliver the purpose, the invisible leader. And so leadership becomes incredibly accessibility, because it allows everyone who believes in the bigger purpose to be a leader. And that belief in that purpose is the central activator of leadership. And invisible leadership is incredibly powerful. You may have heard the story of the NASA janitor before, because not only does it compel us as organizations, it compels us as individuals. John F. Kennedy was giving a talk at the Space Center as he was launching the Apollo missions, and he was in the hangar and he bumped into a janitor and said, "Hey, what do you do here?" And the janitor very calmly got up and said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon." And it went on to dramatically change JFK's thinking about our country and about what leadership was, that it's not what your country or any one president can do for you, it's what you can do for your country. When we transcend to a bigger purpose, we transcend to a bigger other-centered purpose that's the leader of our lives, it can actually foster more commitment and more performance. And actually, Andrew Carton from the Wharton School studied how NASA actually cultivated that belief amongst people at every level of the organization. And there's two ways that they did it. The first is that they tied everyone's tasks to that bigger purpose. And second, they consistently, through speech and rhetoric, made sure that the purpose of advancing science and landing on the moon was more important than any one person. And that's the power of invisible leadership, is that in any task that we do, whether it's mopping the floors or doing financials, that purpose is the leader and pulls us forward. So I want to end today talking about how we do this. So how do we bring this idea of invisible leadership into organizations to transform organizations? How do we lead from purpose? And the first step is to make sure that the purpose is more important than any person or group of people in your organization. And that is a key step, and it's a big mindset shift. That how have we instilled this belief in why we exist? And to uncover that briefly, you could ask yourself the question, or your team of leaders the question, or your team of people that you're working with the question, outside of what we do or what we get for what we do, why do we exist? Why do our jobs exist? And why does our organization exist? And that answer is your purpose. That answer is your invisible leader. And you can also reflect on times where a reason or a cause that was bigger than a person serves as the most motivating factor in your organization or group. And this can be really powerful in identifying invisible leaders that are already there, purposes that are already alive and awake for people in the organization. One way to do that is to develop shared dramatic experiences. Just like the story around the University of Colorado Buffalo's football team, they share that experience of hearing from Sal directly in front of them. And while we won't always have stories like that in our organizations, we always have human beings that our work touches in some sort of way. Every organization on the planet exists to solve some human problem or fulfill some sort of human need. And so if we can bring the experience of that person's life that's inevitably at the end of every supplier service chain to the forefront of the everyday narrative in our work, we can create shared dramatic experiences. And it starts with how you onboard people, how you socialize people to your organization or your movement, how you talk to them about the organization and why it exists, and really making sure that you're giving them an opportunity to experience the purpose. And this can be every day, you know, when you're delegating tasks to somebody or working with a partner on something, that before you tell people what to do or how to do it, make sure you show them and let them feel why it matters. That's one critical way to bring this invisible leader to the forefront. And these are some other key practices of clarifying purpose, communicating purpose, and then connecting purpose. A way to clarify purpose and bring the invisible leader to the center is to focus on the big human problem you solve as an organization and not necessarily the solutions you offer. Oftentimes in modern organizations and movements, we're touting the solutions we have, the specifications of those solutions, but ultimately those things don't do anything to differentiate us from anybody else. What differentiates us is the human problem that we exist to solve in the first place. Reframe that narrative, focus on that big problem. Make purpose visible in your environment. You can design a purposeful environment by creating, pictures of people that are impacted by your product or service or what you do in the organization, bringing those narratives to the forefront, making sure your purpose statement resonates with people at all levels of the organization. I talked about this, focusing on the people at the other end of transactions. Being story collectors and storytellers. You could probably feel some of the emotion of the University of Colorado Buffalo's story. That story is an illustrative of not just how it worked in a team, but how a story can elicit the emotional connection to something bigger than any one person. So setting the daily narrative around those stories is powerful. And then identifying some of the barriers to delivering this purpose and to being motivated and compelled by an invisible leader, and aligning key processes with purpose like your onboarding, your training, performance evaluations for yourself as an individual. How do the processes in your life look? How do you evaluate your own success? Is it based on things you get for what you do? Is it based on why you do what you do, that big purpose? And then finally, reward purposeful behavior. When you reward people who transcended a bigger purpose and they're clearly there to seek that other-centeredness of why you exist in the first place as an organization, you create an other-centered and purposeful culture. And so finally, the invisible leader is a common purpose. It asserts clearly that the best leaders aren't people. I had the opportunity in my first book, The Invisible Leader, to talked to janitors, coaches, stories from CEOs, Fortune 500 companies, bus drivers, mechanics. And what I found really is that the most extraordinary people do ordinary things with an extraordinary perspective. And that extraordinary perspective is engagement and attachment to something bigger, to some reason that's bigger than anything that they do. And what's really cool about invisible leadership and about leading with purpose is that we can learn a purposeful mindset. And there are really profound ways of doing that. So I want to thank you for tuning in today. I hope you found this concept of invisible leadership enlightening, and I hope that you can use some of these tools immediately to go back into your organization or wherever you work and start transforming the way you work by being compelled by a purpose and not necessarily a person, thing, or result. So thank you all.
On behalf of the JMU Alumni Association and the Madison Network, thank you and congratulations to our presenter and alumnus, Zach Mercurio, for creating and sharing this on-demand Madison Network webinar, giving us a glimpse into his first book, The Invisible Leader, Transform Your Life, Work, and Organization with the Power of Authentic Purpose, showing us that extraordinary leaders are ordinary people doing extraordinary, purposeful things. You can stay connected with Zach and his work on Twitter and Instagram at Zach Mercurio and Facebook at The Mercurio. And we hope that you continue to fulfill your personal and professional aspirations by activating your Madison network through connection, conversation, and engagement by dedicating time for opportunities like this on-demand webinar. Thanks, everyone, and go Dukes.